Hi, this is Heath, and it's time for another Media Diet Comics commentary. Today's focus is Conan the Barbarian. We've got two Conan-related series that we're going to share with you today. First up is the current ongoing Conan series at Marvel. Marvel currently holds the Conan license in the United States, and I just dipped into the current ongoing series. We've got two issues, number 14 and number 15, that we'll be talking about today. There's another Conan-related comic, though, that's also available in the States currently, and it is actually a slightly more interesting situation and story. It's published by Ablaze, and Ablaze is based out of Portland, Oregon. These are 3 issues of a current mini-series published by Ablaze, the Cimmerian People of the Black Circle. And the top of the covers say Robert E. Howard's Savage Hero, Uncensored. And so it sounds pretty interesting and intriguing. We'll talk about that in a moment. First up, though, the Marvel book, because Conan has a long history at Marvel. In fact, on the cover number 15, there's this little bug down here in the corner by the UPC celebrating 50 years of Conan at Marvel. So Conan's been at Marvel for 50 years. It's 2020, so that means at least since 1970. And the current series is worth checking out. They're no longer adapting Howard writing, Robert E. Howard being the creator of Conan the Barbarian, but they are still based in the legend and the lore. So we've got the Nemedian Chronicles quoted here, or at least new. Actually, that is one of the most iconic pieces of writing from Howard, from the Nemedian Chronicles. But this current ongoing series is part 3 and part 4 of a story called Into the Crucible. And it's written by Jim Zub, whose name you'll recognize from a couple of other comics that we've reviewed recently. We mentioned him in relation to, I think, the D&D comics because of his connection to the Rick and Morty comic. And drawn by Roger Antonio for issue 15. And then just dipping back to number 14, same creative team, Jim Zub, writer, and Raj or Roger Antonio, artist. If you want to correct my pronunciation, please do so in the comments below. And the storyline Into the Crucible is interesting. It's fun. It takes place in the holy city of Garchal. Number 15 situates that actually in Uttara Kuru. And in the city of Garchal, they worship this god, Chali May, also known as the Many Deaths. And one of the ways that they worship this god of many arms and many deaths is by putting citizens and adventurers through what's called the Crucible. And they send them into this underground kind of labyrinth or lair. Those lights on the right with the gemstones represent the lives of the adventurers that are going down into that labyrinth. And as they die or are defeated, because to celebrate this god of many deaths, you have to kill the other people, as the lives are snuffed out, the lights dim, leaving one who is then seen as a hero. And so Conan finds himself as part of this Crucible tournament, kind of, against his will. Not quite sure how he found himself there, why he chose. He was tricked into this foul pit, it says. The other people think he's one of the blessed contestants, but he's not. Wonderful image there by Antonio of the god of many deaths. And so he's basically with a group of people going through the labyrinth. And they encounter various threats, kind of overcome them as a group through teamwork. And then they end up, through a shaman of the afterlife, channeling one of the previous or prior contestants who's gone on before. And he gives them some information that causes them to not trust each other as much. And you might think that information is welcome and helpful, but in the end ends up probably sowing more discord than helpfulness. But it changes the group dynamic, changes their relationship and friendship, and they continue making their way through the labyrinth with a lesser degree of trust than in the past. There's a wonderful image of a giant crocodile or alligator that they encounter as part of the going through the Crucible, and in the end, they escape to daylight. Without telling you what happens after that point, it does set up the next issue, number 16, quite well. And so this current run of Conan, even though inspired, informed by Howard's writing, not adapting or returning to his writing, worth reading. Jim Zub seems to be doing a good job writing D&D and similar sword and fantasy, sword and sorcery, sword and sandal comics. So Conan the Barbarian, current Marvel series, number 14 and 15. Check it out if you like Conan. Or if you like Red Sonja, for that matter. Or if you like D&D. The next Conan series we're going to talk about, though, comes from that Portland, Oregon-based publishing company, Ablaze, which I was not familiar with. I actually don't know what else Ablaze does. I'm always interested in new publishing companies, so I will check that out. Looking at this issue, there don't seem to be house ads informing us about other projects. There's just variant covers and a promo for the next issue, see if that's consistent, and then the next series. So, not quite sure about Ablaze, but interesting story about this comic. So 3 issues, People of the Black Circle. I'm just going to show you the covers. As you can see at the top, Robert E. Howard's Savage Hero, uncensored, and it's a 3-issue adaptation of the story, People of the Black Circle. We'll address that in a moment. And a bit of an interesting story about how it got here. So this is a reprint of a European comic published by Editions Glénat, and I'm expecting that to be from France. I actually did read up about this to learn about it, but I'm not remembering everything that I read. So there was originally issued in France, Editions Glénat. In Europe, Howard's writing is in the public domain, and so there is no estate managing control of the writings. There's no need to get permission or a license like there is here in the States with the Howard estate. And so this was published in France by Editions Glénat. And it's written by Sylvain Runberg and drawn by Jae-Kwang Park, or Jae-Kwang Park. I believe that's a Korean name. Again, feel free to correct my pronunciation in the comments. And the gist of the original Edition Glénat is that it is a strict adaptation of Howard's original writings. And the comic opens by saying that Howard's Conan first appeared in the pages of pulp magazines in the 30s, and that he contributed 17 Conan stories to Weird Tales magazine from 1932 to 1936. Through these stories, we see Robert E. Howard's Savage Hero take shape. And so the idea behind the Edition Glénat books might be, let's adapt those 17 stories into comics form, truly adapting them as they were written and as they were originally published in the 30s. That might be where this uncensored comes from. The uncensored could also be a comment on the Howard estate trying to stop the republication of these comics in the States by not granting it a license. So when Ablaze was originally trying to bring these books to the States, the Robert E. Howard estate actually legally tried to stop them from publishing them in the U.S., and I believe it ended up moving forward. This was like at the end of 2019 that all this was happening. It ended up moving forward because in Europe it is in the public domain. And so the neat thing about the comic is actually not that uncensored nature. I mean, it is interesting that it was published in Europe, so it wasn't published in the States. That is a form of censorship, some might say. I don't think it's censorship. It's a legal and a business disagreement. But the idea of adapting the comics as originally written is interesting, and that gets a little bit lost. Park's artwork is a little dense and heavy. This is just the second page of the first issue, but I just want to show you a little bit of what it kind of looks like. Relatively dense page designs, relatively dense panel content. It does result in some interesting imagery, which is wonderful to look at. But all that said, the uncensored nature, portraying things that perhaps Marvel can't portray in its current licensed comics, gets a little lost. And so, for example, here we have, I believe, a daughter stabbing her husband or a wife, a daughter stabbing her father or a wife stabbing her husband. And that might get a little lost, given how dense and how busy the page and panels are. But good art. A little bit of, Asian flair to it. Occasionally feels like manga. I'm wondering if Park has done other manga work or similar comics. But that's not the most interesting thing about the comic. The most interesting thing about the comic is that Ablaze, and perhaps Editions Glénat, is also publishing the original story in text. And so in this first issue, we have 8 pages reprinted of the story, accompanying however many pages of comics. And that continues for the next 2 issues. And so again, issue 2 of the series continues the story, People of the Black Circle, comics adaptation strictly from the text, and then after the comic, the text. And in the 3rd issue, the same. Comics adaptation, uncensored, they say, and one might think that coming from Europe, that means a little more blood and gore, a little more stuff that we can't necessarily see in comics in the States. I don't know that that's actually the case. And then at the end, more of the story reprinted. And so that is interesting. It is drawing me in as a reader to not just read the comic, but to also reread the original fiction. And so that story does end here, and so adapted in 3 issues. And then the next story that they're going to do is The Frost Giant's Daughter, which is a wonderful, wonderful, wonderful story. And that seems to be drawn by somebody else, Robin Recht. And so there's a cover image in black and white for that forthcoming series. And I think that there was one preceding this. And so Ablaze has been bringing the Edition Glénat stuff to the States for some time since they overcame that legal injunction at the end of 2019. So if you like Conan, clearly do check out the current Marvel licensed books, but also dig a little deeper and see if you can find these Ablaze uncensored comics. This is just one story. Another story before this might have been Queen of the Black Coast. Going to have to look into that. And then the next one, The Frost Giant's Daughter. Check it out. It's actually really interesting. True adaptation of the weird fiction from Weird Tales, reprints the public domain story, and a good way to kind of return to the roots of the character in comics form while reading that fiction hand in hand, while still being sure to keep up with the current Marvel licensed series, which takes new stories, new directions, new life to the character, which has now been with Marvel for 50 years. So Conan the Barbarian, ongoing series from Marvel, written by Jim Zub, and then this really, really interesting series of miniseries coming to us from Portland, Oregon, from a publishing company called Ablaze, adapting the original pulp stories by Howard and reprinting the original pulp stories by Howard. So this, I think, of the 2, if you could only get one, check this out, at least for one run of one story. Really, really interesting stuff. And we'll see how the uncensored nature. The uncensored might just be because of the legal injunction, but it also might refer to going back to the source fiction, which is really, really cool. So thank you, Ablaze, for doing that. And let's just give a shout out to the editors Rich Young and Patrice Louinet. Colors here by Hiroyuki Ushima. So I'm going to have to look a little more into that creative team from the European publication. But Ablaze Publishing. Wonder what else you got going on, because this was a neat idea and a good example of how licensing stuff from other countries could work well. Surprised that Heavy Metal didn't try to get this. I think you snoozed. You totally that should have been, could have been something that ended up in the magazine over time. So Conan the Barbarian, 2 series, both worth checking out, especially the Ablaze. Have a good day.